Welcome to our TOK presentation on the information of ACTA.
ACTA is the Anti-Counterfeiting and Trade Agreement, which is basically a multinational treaty meant to establish international standards for the enforcement of intellectual property rights.
What this means is that when countries sign this treaty, it means that they agree to be part of like a trade agreement between several countries to deal with ACTA in the same way and to deal with the enforcement of intellectual property rights in the same way. And so this picture encompasses sort of what ACTA might do to the internet if it does get signed in a lot of countries. So it could limit freedom and internet as well.
And basically, ACTA is aimed at stopping trademark counterfeiting and the piracy of goods. But ACTA also considers piracy as counterfeiting. And once ACTA is implemented, you can no longer share information as it would be a breach of trademark rules.
And this connects to SOPA and PIPA, which are two laws that were trying to be passed in the States by the government. And these were going to stop our own piracy acts, was to stop the copyrighted content such as movies and music from being pirated and being shared online for free. And PIPA was also a similar act.
Now, ACTA does have implications, and the main ones were if ACTA were to become active, then there would be a limit to the information that we would be allowed to access, either in print or online.
So a really good example of this is that search results on Google would then be limited to the people who own the information, so the parent companies or the people who own those pieces of information would have to allow Google to use it, which means that they have complete control over which information gets let out to the public.
So basically this means there would be no more Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is generated completely by users and is entirely free, and does not necessarily need sources, and usually is not paid for. YouTube would be gone completely because of the use of copyrighted music, other copyrighted content, for example films, parts of films, and as well.
Twitter would also be gone because users can upload photos, and if one photo has one piece of copyrighted content, say maybe a Coke can or something like that, then the user who uploaded that photo can be fined, and Twitter, the website, will either be fined or taken down. And this applies to the same as Facebook as well. If there's a piece of music or copyrighted content that is shared, the users who have shared it or used it will be fined, and the website will also be taken down.
So basically the way this works is that, say you gain information from a copyrighted source, so for example you pay for a cooking class, and you learn all these lovely new recipes in cooking class, and then you decide to go home and you share the information that you paid for with your friends, and then your friends share it with their friends. However, because you have shared the information without people who have gained the information paying for it, and they have also shared it without paying for it, according to ACTA you would be breaking the law.
So whether you have paid for a piece of music and then you want to show it to your friends, you can't do that because that would be breaking the law, because they haven't paid for that same piece of music, which would affect all of us.
And now basically in here we're talking a lot about information, and we're defining information as a potential form of knowledge.
Yeah. And so in this case, if ACTA is limiting our access to information, whether it's through the internet or just a phone call with a friend, then it's also limiting our access to knowledge, which is a basic human right according to UNESCO.
And this brings us to our main knowledge issue, which is how can limiting information affect the concept of free will? And to break this down a little bit, we're defining limiting information as limiting access to potential knowledge, and where knowledge is defined as justified true belief. And we're defining the concept of free will with a philosophical definition, which is deliberative choosing on the basis of desires and values.
Now, this knowledge issue ties in very well with history, because history's meaning can be stifled by suppressed causation, and there's also a manipulation of versions of events to suit a certain perspective or a bias.
For example, if there's two sides of a war and two different authors writing, historians writing, their accounts could be entirely different based on how that country wanted the war to be perceived. And this brings us back to the restriction of knowledge, which brings us back to the implementation of ACTA.
So our first claim for this knowledge issue is if limitations on information are put into place, then your free will is limited. An example of this is if our set of sources that we have is limited to a certain choice, then our knowledge that we can gain from those pieces of information is then limited, which poses a problem.
However, the counterclaim to this would be that limitations are often put into place for a reason, usually for the good of the people, so to speak. And an example of this would be China and their anti-Westernization policies. For example, China blocks Google because they don't want people to access information that might not be tie in with their beliefs and their values. Our second claim is that the concept of free will stems from the ability to choose what you will believe. And the best example of this would be freedom of religion, being able to choose who you believe in, why you believe in, and what you believe in.
And the counterclaim to this is sometimes what you believe in is dictated by outside forces. And a really good example of this is the news that we get every single day. We get our news from specific sources, and those sources are controlled by a very specific group of people. And this group of people has the opportunity to edit and decide which information is passed through to the general public. So they have control over the information which we receive, so therefore the knowledge that we gain.
Now our next claim is that awareness of limitations on access to potential knowledge can lead to the awareness of an impediment of free will. And one of the main examples for this would be, for example, if a person in a country that is politically restraining realizes they have a lack of freedom, they might be inspired to dissent from that country, thereby trying to exercise their free will.
However, the counterclaim to this is that limiting potential information can sometimes lead to people seeking out more resourceful ways of obtaining that knowledge, and thereby exercising their free will. So a really good example of this, which is a bit closer to time, is that a couple of years ago Turkey blocked YouTube, and people would find ways to bypass this by using proxy servers or by changing their DNS settings, which are just a couple of ways to bypass it. But by bypassing it, they are exercising their free will and gaining access to the knowledge which they want to.
Now we have two auxiliary knowledge issues, and this is the first of them, which is to what extent does the ambiguity of language limit the acquisition of knowledge? Language as a way of knowing is simultaneously reliable and weak, and this stems mainly from its ambiguity. And
its ambiguity is similar to the ambiguity that can be seen in art, because art can be interpreted in many, many different ways, and there's no correct answer, which is the same with language. And so knowledge shown through imitation and artistic means, such as suggestion and symbols, it happens in art.
Our first claim for this would be that language is so ambiguous that it allows for multiple interpretations. And this is mainly because language is very nuanced. One person can think that one word means something different to them than to another person, thereby finding two different definitions for that same word. However, language's ambiguity allows for a greater acquisition of knowledge because of the possibility of multiple interpretations. So a really, really good example of this is in literature in English class. When we study a piece of literature, we discuss it, and that's because we get loads and loads of different points of view that come together to create one much broader piece of knowledge which we can understand from multiple points of view. Our second claim is that knowledge can only be acquired through language, and we said this because language is a primary means of communication, whether it is written or it is spoken. However,
knowledge can be communicated without language, and often through other ways of knowing. And emotion is a really good way of this, because emotion is rarely communicated through, it can be communicated through language, but it's also communicated through body language, gestures, and facial expressions as well, and it doesn't necessarily have to use language.
Now, moving on to our second auxiliary knowledge issue, which is, are there ethical boundaries in obtaining knowledge? And here we come into the ideas of ethics in the human sciences, particularly psychological experiments on people.
This is most likely criticisms on the Stanley Milgram experiments.
And the Stanley Milgram experiment, which we looked at in class, was basically when there was a teacher and the student, and the teacher was told to give an electric shock to the student whenever the student got a question wrong. And the point, what Milgram wanted to find out was how far people would go into obeying authority, how far they would go to hurt someone in obeying authority. And obviously this received a lot of criticism because of what was done.
The Stanford prison experiment was when groups of Stanford students were split into two groups, either into a guard or into a prisoner. And it was a prison experiment to see whether the people in a position of power would take advantage of the power, and whether if people who were being oppressed would then group together and revolt against these people. it resulted in the guards taking physical and mental abuse towards the prisoners.
And in the case of these two experiments, what happened was basically the way in which they were conducted was what raised the ethical questions. For example, in the Stanford prison experiment, the main psychologist who was conducting the experiment became too close. He became the superintendent of the prison, and therefore he could not actually see the destruction that was happening to the people, the psychological destruction that was happening to them. And this brings us to another question, was, are we actually ethically justified to go to any lengths in the pursuit of knowledge? And obviously this is still up to debate.
Our first claim is that once a physical boundary is violated, ethical boundaries are also breached.
And a very recent example of this would be the Abu Ghraib scandal in Afghanistan, where US soldiers ended up torturing and humiliating prisoners. And in this case, the ethical boundaries were breached because people were being dehumanized beyond what would be normally considered ethical treatment in a prison.
And the counterclaim to this is that sometimes the only way to achieve information is through physical or mental violation. And an example for this is a lot of time in in psychological experiments, electric shocks are used, and physical ways of nearly harming people are used to gain different pieces of information. So we're gaining information even though we're harming people in the name of science.
And our second claim was that ethical boundaries are implicitly understood and recognized by all. And this comes from the idea of
our universal set of morals, which is a set of morals that everybody understands. There are things that we should do and there are things that we shouldn't do. However, the counterclaim to this is that realistically, it is impossible to observe and understand the ethical values of all people, since everyone thinks differently.
Yeah, and this brings us to the idea of moral relativism, that in different cultures there are different sets of moral values, and that not everyone can believe in the same things because of their traditional cultural values.
This leads on to our from the knowledge issues, our auxiliary knowledge issues, it leads us on to our different real-life situations. Our first real-life situation that leads on to is censorship in China, and they use a restriction of websites such as Google and even YouTube to hinder westernization and to preserve Chinese culture. And this may cause the population to be unaware of potentially important pieces of information about the world around them. And a really good example of this is in North Korea, where nearly nobody has access to the internet there. And even if they do, it's so highly restricted that it's potentially a worthless piece of information for the public.
And of course, in this case, we as Westerners see this as censorship is a bad thing in this case. However, censorship can be a good thing, and this is particularly the censorship of adult content online and in print. And this comes from the prevalence of pornography or extreme violence. And the thing about this is that it can be, keeping it hidden on the web or in print means that those who wish to access it and have the means to find it can, but also those people who don't want to see it or don't want to have access to it don't have to see it. So it's not as if by putting it out, not completely uncensoring adult content, would basically be allowing children to be able to view it at their will.
And now that more and more younger people are going on the internet, it's even more important to perhaps censor the more adult content on the internet so that the younger generation don't fall upon it. This leads us to our underlying question, does the implementation of ACTA affect our free will? And there are two sides to this. The first side is that ACTA won't necessarily limit our free will, because there are so many sources that aren't necessarily online of which we can choose from. So there are libraries around the world from which we can gain information and knowledge.
However, ACTA will limit our free will because it will affect us beyond the realm of the internet. ACTA does not only affect things that sources we might access on the internet, it can affect things we read in books. It could affect films we might want to watch, because one big proponent of ACTA is actually the MPAA, which is one of the big movie picture industries in the United States. And basically, we will be limited, even whether or not we use the internet often or not. And that's a problem. And also the way in which ACTA has been dealt with between countries is extremely underhanded. The public has not had very much say at all in whether or not a country will sign ACTA.
And we have to remember that ACTA isn't just going to affect the internet, it will affect everything else. So the way that we speak to people, the way that we talk, the way that we are going to be able to give knowledge across to other people is going to be restricted through ACTA.
And another problem with ACTA is that the language in which it is written is very ambiguous. It can be interpreted in many different ways, and there are actually several clauses in ACTA which say that the country may choose to implement ACTA in the way it sees fit, and that is not specified in ACTA, which means that any country who signs it can do whatever they want with it, basically.
They may be able to twist ACTA into a way where they can use it when they want to and when it's useful to them, but perhaps ignore other things when they don't want to. And that was our presentation on ACTA. And
thank you. Cool.
So we have a few minutes. If anybody has any questions, the students are prepared to respond or answer any questions that you might have, or if you have any comments on the topic.
Main points was that ACTA limits the availability of information to people. Yes. Consequently, the availability of knowledge.
Yes.
And this has a negative impact on their free will.
Yes.
We all have different languages working in our brains. Yes. We all have different senses working in different ways. Yeah. Isn't our ability to access information and knowledge extremely limited anyway?
We're talking about our information that we gain online, and the information that we may be able to gain online or from other people if they tell us things, that will be restricted. So it will, even if we do have restricted access to information now, it will restrict it even more and further cut the knowledge that we can obtain from the internet and from other sources.
Yeah, just a couple of follow-up questions. You started off talking about information.
Yeah.
Obviously the main idea is knowledge here. When did information become knowledge?
It didn't become knowledge. Information becomes potential knowledge. Information is a piece of potential knowledge that we may be able to.
And that is why we're addressing it. Knowledge, information as potential knowledge, things that might become knowledge. Because information in itself is not knowledge, but it can possibly become knowledge if we choose to believe it.
So we're talking about information and knowledge.
Yes.
Okay. I just find that something that was occurring to me as you were talking about was there's the underlying assumption here that free will is a good thing.
Well,
is it?
It depends which situation we're in. I think free will is a good thing. I think it is too.
Well, I think being able to choose your values, being able to decide for yourself what you want to do with your life, what you want to see, what you want to access, what you want to learn, what you want to know is better than having someone else in a position of authority decide for you.
However, free will is not necessarily a good thing because there are a set of rules put in place, and they're perhaps put there to guide us to a better future, a more healthy future if we don't have free will. But I believe that free will is important.
Yes, Mr.
First, I thought that was great. I thought you had a really nice style about it and some basic observations. The preparation of this talk was outstanding. And the flow between the two of you, how you interact with your presentation and went backwards and forwards, spoke to incredible preparations. So congratulations on it. So it was a tremendous amount of intellectual ideas content in here. I'm going to offer that I'm not sure it was always coherent. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but where you ended up intellectually at the end of the presentation from where you started wasn't necessarily the same place. It does prompt this thought. At one point at the beginning you were talking about a right to information, whether it's a YouTube video or a Wikipedia entry or whatever, that for ACTA to stop this is wrong and affecting free will. It made me wonder, presumably you don't advocate into walking to public libraries, taking a book out, photocopying it and sending it out to everybody you know. And in the old style moral vocabulary, that would have been quite clearly seen as wrong.
Yes.
And your presentation made me wonder that internet behaviours we are creating kind of a new moral vocabulary, and I think that's very interesting as an idea. Enough maybe. I want to ask you what you thought of your presentation and what feedback would be useful to you.
Perhaps we could have connected it to more relevant things to ourselves, maybe. Things that connect back more to us personally as students. Perhaps.
That we had a lot of a very broad base of information that was relevant to lots of different areas, but not necessarily back to ourselves, which I guess we should have done. Or could have done.
Yeah, perhaps.
I think the examples that you used were excellent. I've rarely seen a TLK presentation with so many relevant examples. You basically have a solid example at every point that you made. As another thing that struck me while I was listening, does every single claim in the world have a counterclaim?
No, but we try to find claims that would have a counterclaim.
We were trying to find claims. We were trying to find claims that did have counterclaims so that we could give both sides, which is what we were kind of doing.
And that's what you're expected to do in the essay and the presentation.
Yeah.
Sometimes what happens though, as you're presenting an argument and you're bringing the counterclaim every single time, it's quite difficult for the listener to figure out exactly what you're doing.
Sorry, yeah.
Because you're constantly going between the claim and the counterclaim.
We're just trying to give a large overview so that we
Right, and that's what the
get
rubric asks
everything.
for.
And perhaps try to be a little less biased when we're beginning the presentation.
But you definitely had a direction that you were going.
Yeah.
You had an opinion.
It's very easy just to say that ACTA is awful and that it should be stopped right now, but with the TRK presentation we're supposed to give both sides, this was the easiest way that we found to sort of give both sides.
Are you really worried about it? Like, do you think because they make these policies it's going to change how you download films or share films on home drives?
Well, already we've seen that the
Yeah,
website
it's already
megaupload.com is already been taken down, and megaupload.com was not only a way that people shared movies and music, but also how they shared like work files. So it's not only affected us, but also people who use it for work. And I think it will start slowly to start taking effect on our lives, whether the countries choose to do it in their own way, because ACTA enables countries to search your luggage at borders for copyrighted goods. So they could search your iPad or your iPod or
And
something
they
like
can
that.
search your bags for generic brand drugs, for example, which would be illegal under ACTA as well. You would not be able to carry anything that was generic or that would essentially rip off a trademark.
Yeah. So I think we will start seeing it become more in effect slowly over the next couple of years. And so in that respect, yeah, I'm worried about it.
In the scenario you showed about the chef,
Yeah.
and then the cooking lesson,